The deeper Elias rode into the woods, the more the world seemed to close in around him. The trail, little more than a scar in the earth, was swallowed by a dense canopy of pine and spruce that choked the afternoon light, leaving the air beneath cool and thick with the scent of damp rot and resin. It was a silence that felt heavy, a blanket smothering the usual sounds of the forest. No birds called, no squirrels chattered from the boughs. The only sounds were the steady plod of his horse's hooves and the creak of his own saddle, noises that seemed intrusively loud in the oppressive quiet. He had been told the camp was remote, but this felt less like isolation and more like exile, as if the very trees were standing guard against the outside world. When the camp finally appeared through a break in the timber, it did so without fanfare. A collection of rough-hewn log structures huddled in a clearing, looking less built and more like they had grown, fungus-like, from the forest floor. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in the tableau. As he drew closer, the men emerged from the shadows of the bunkhouse and the cook shack, not with curiosity, but with a slow, weary inevitability. They were a hard-bitten lot, their faces carved from the same weathered wood as their surroundings, their clothes stained with sap and soil. They watched him with a flat, unnerving stillness, their eyes tracking his every move. A large man with a grizzled beard and the bearing of authority detached himself from the group. This was Foreman Briggs, his hand raised not in welcome, but as a simple signal to halt. His gaze was appraising, but there was a deep-seated weariness in it, a shadow that had nothing to do with the physical labor of logging. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, needle-strewn earth. The formalities were brief and hollow. Briggs's voice was a low rumble, offering a bunk and a warning about the work, but his attention seemed divided, his eyes flicking toward the dark tree line as if expecting something. The other loggers offered no introductions, only silent, sullen stares. Their silence was a tangible thing, a wall erected between themselves and the newcomer. It was not the quiet of men tired from a long day's work. It was the tense, watchful hush of men waiting for a storm to break. His unease solidified as Briggs led him toward the long, low bunkhouse. The building was a testament to crude utility, its logs dark with age and moisture. And it was on these dark logs that Elias's eyes caught the strange details. Etched into the wood, almost disguised by the grain, were carvings. They were weathered, some so old they were little more than faint grooves, but their patterns were unsettling. Coiled, serpentine lines intersected with angular, rune-like symbols. There were shapes that suggested faces, their features distorted in agony or rage, and others that mimicked the gnarled, grasping forms of roots and thorns. They were not the idle doodles of bored men. They felt deliberate, a frantic scripture carved by desperate hands. He ran a finger over one, the wood rough and cold, and a shiver traced its way down his spine. The men watched him notice the carvings, and a new tension entered their postures. A few looked away, suddenly interested in their boots or the distant trees. One man, a hulking figure with a shock of red hair, met his gaze with a cold, challenging glare, as if daring him to ask. The friendly clap on the back Briggs gave him then felt forced, a poor performance meant to dispel the gloom. But the performance failed. The eerie silence, the haunted looks of the men, and the ominous story told by the scarred walls of the bunkhouse all converged into a single, chilling certainty. Elias had not simply arrived at a logging camp. He had stepped into a place holding its breath, a place where something old and wrong was sleeping, and his arrival had just disturbed its slumber. Sleep in the bunkhouse was a fragile, elusive thing. The men's breathing soon settled into the ragged rhythms of exhaustion, a chorus of snores and sighs that should have been a comfort, a sound of human life in the vast, dark wilderness. But for Elias, lying stiffly on his narrow cot, the sounds of the men were merely a backdrop for the other noises that seeped into the long, black hours. The wind, which had been still at dusk, picked up as midnight approached, but it did not howl. Instead, it slithered through the chinks in the log walls, a sound like dry, rustling parchment. And within that rustling, he heard them. At first, they were so faint he thought them a trick of the mind, the auditory ghosts born of fatigue and the day's unease. But they persisted, threading through the wind's whisper. They were not voices he could understand, not words in any language he knew, but the cadence was unmistakably human. A soft, sibilant murmur, a conversation of phantoms just beyond the edge of hearing. He lay perfectly still, his senses strained, trying to lock onto the source. The whispers seemed to circle the bunkhouse, sometimes seeming to come from the far corner near the wood stove, other times drifting from right outside the shuttered window next to his head. They held no warmth, no comfort. They were the sound of secrets being shared in the dark, of grievances nursed for decades. Shadows, thick and liquid, began to shift in the moonless dark. The pot-bellied stove in the center of the room cast a dull, orange glow that did little to push back the night, instead creating a landscape of dancing, distorted shapes. More than once, Elias's eyes caught a deeper patch of darkness detaching itself from the wall, a human-like silhouette that seemed to glide across the floor before dissolving into the greater gloom near a sleeping man's cot. He watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, as one such shadow seemed to linger over the form of the logger called Sam, a slender man who slept fitfully, his limbs twitching. The shadow bent, formless and intent, for a long moment before fading away. The whispers around Sam's bunk seemed to intensify into a soft, chiding hiss before moving on. Dawn came as a reluctant gray seepage through the grimy window panes, banishing the whispers and the shifting dark back to wherever they hid during the day. The men rose with the grim practicality of those for whom sunrise offered no joy, only another day of back-breaking labor. The haunted stillness of the night was replaced by the clatter of tin cups and the low grumble of morning voices, but the tension from the previous evening remained, a taut wire running beneath the surface of their routine. Out at the felling site, the sharp, rhythmic bite of axes into pine filled the air. Elias was paired with Sam, the man he had seen shadowed in the night. Sam worked with a nervous, jerky energy, his eyes darting toward the dense woods that pressed in on all sides. He was clearly skilled, his swings practiced and true, but a pervasive anxiety seemed to radiate from him. They were working on a thick-bellied fir when it happened. Sam's axe, on its backswing, seemed to catch on nothing, twisting in his grip. Instead of a clean arc, it wobbled, the honed edge skipping off the tree trunk and grazing his own forearm with a sickening, wet thud. Sam cried out, more in shock than pain, dropping the axe to clutch at his arm. Blood, shockingly bright, welled up between his fingers, staining the cuff of his woolen shirt. The other loggers stopped their work, gathering around. It was a minor cut, a shallow gash that would need stitching but was far from life-threatening. Yet, the reaction of the men was disproportionate. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a fear that a simple accident could not warrant. Foreman Briggs pushed through the group, his expression grim. He examined the wound with a practiced eye, then looked at Sam, whose face was a mask of shame and terror. "Clumsy," Briggs declared, his voice too loud, too forceful. "Just a moment of clumsiness. Get him to the cook shack and have it sewn up." The other men quickly echoed the sentiment, a chorus of forced nonchalance. "Happens to the best of us, Sam. Watch your swing next time." But Elias watched the scene unfold and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He had seen Sam's grip, firm and sure, moments before. He had seen the way the axe had not simply slipped, but had seemed to be tugged, as if by an unseen hand. He remembered the whispering shadows gathered around Sam's bunk, the lingering darkness, the hiss. This was no simple clumsiness. It was a warning, and as the men dispersed, their forced laughter brittle and sharp in the cold morning air, Elias's suspicion, first planted by the silent camp and the carved walls, took root and began to grow into a chilling, undeniable dread. The morning's incident with Sam's axe had cast a long shadow over the day's labor. The men worked with a renewed, almost frantic intensity, as if by focusing solely on the physical act of felling trees they could outrun the unease that clung to the camp like the morning mist. Their conversations were terse, their laughter absent. Elias worked alongside them, his muscles burning with the unfamiliar strain, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the past day and night like a puzzle with missing pieces. The oppressive silence, the spectral whispers, the carvings, and now the strange, almost purposeful accident. They were all threads of a single, dark tapestry, and he was determined to find its pattern. His opportunity came when Foreman Briggs, perhaps seeking to keep him occupied and away from the more dangerous work for a while, assigned him to organize the camp's supply shed. The shed was a cramped, dusty lean-to attached to the main bunkhouse, a jumble of rusting tools, burlap sacks of beans and flour, coils of rope, and spare axes. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, iron, and dry rot. As he shifted crates and sorted through the disarray, his hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath a stack of worn horse blankets. Curiosity piqued. He pried it up with the tip of his knife. Hidden in the shallow space below was a book, its leather cover cracked and furred with dust. It was a ledger, the kind used for keeping accounts, but as Elias carefully lifted it and blew the grime from its surface, he saw it held a different kind of record. The pages were filled not with numbers, but with names and dates, written in a variety of hands, some precise and copperplate, others a rough, sprawling scrawl. It was a roster of every man who had ever worked at the camp, stretching back decades. He began to read, his finger tracing down the columns. At first, it seemed a simple, if morbid, census. But as he compared the birth years listed beside each name, a pattern emerged. One so bizarre it made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. A significant number of the men, scattered across different years of the camp's operation, shared the same birth year, 1866. It was not just a coincidence of a few men. It was a recurring thread, a date that appeared again and again like a sinister refrain. Sam, the man cut by the axe, was born in 1866. So was the large, red-haired logger who had glared at him. And Tom, a quiet, sallow-faced man who seemed to shrink from any interaction, had the same year neatly inscribed beside his name. The discovery was a key clicking in a lock. He waited until the men were washing up for the evening meal, the golden light of dusk painting the clearing. He found Tom alone, scrubbing his hands and face in a wooden water trough, his movements slow and weary. Elias approached cautiously, the ledger held loosely at his side. He mentioned the ledger, framing it as a simple curiosity about the camp's history. He asked Tom, his tone deliberately light, if he knew why so many men from the same year seemed to find their way to this particular, remote patch of wilderness. The effect was instantaneous. Tom froze, his hands still submerged in the cold water. His shoulders, already stooped, seemed to curl in on themselves as if struck. When he turned, water dripping from his chin, his sallow face was ashen, his eyes wide with a fear that was far older and deeper than any reaction to a simple question. He did not answer Elias's query. Instead, his gaze darted around the clearing, ensuring they were not overheard. His voice, when it finally came, was a dry, reedy whisper, stripped of all warmth. He told Elias to put the book back, to forget he ever saw it. His words were not a request, but a desperate plea. He said that some roots were best left buried, that the past in this place was a sleeping beast, and poking at it only made it hungry. There was a wild, knowing look in his eyes, a glimpse of a terror so profound it had become a part of him. Then, as if he had said too much, he turned and hurried away toward the bunkhouse, leaving Elias standing alone in the fading light with the heavy, damning weight of the ledger in his hands. Tom's defensive fear was more revealing than any answer could have been. The camp's secret was not just a story. It was a living, breathing dread that had a firm grip on every man there, and Elias had just tugged on its leash. The towering pine was a giant among giants, its upper branches scratching at a sky the color of tarnished silver. Jake, one of the more experienced climbers, moved up its trunk with a spider's grace, his spurs biting deep into the bark, his rope and harness a familiar second skin. The rhythmic thunk of his axe echoed through the clearing, a steady counterpoint to the grunts and sawing from the ground crew. Elias watched from below, his own work forgotten for a moment, mesmerized by the man's easy confidence so high above the earth. There was a practiced rhythm to the camp now, a tense, fragile normalcy that had settled over the men since Sam's accident. But it was a thin veneer, and everyone felt the cracks beneath. Then the rhythm broke. It was not a loud sound, but a sickeningly soft one. The sound of rope fibers straining and giving way, a dry, popping sigh that was utterly wrong. A collective intake of breath hissed through the men on the ground. Jake's secure line, which had been taut and sure moments before, went slack. For a heart-stopping second, he seemed to hang in the air, a figure of disbelief against the vast gray sky. Then he fell. It was not a clean drop, but a terrible, tumbling cartwheel of limbs and equipment, a brutal ballet of gravity. He crashed through a lattice of lower branches, the sharp snaps of wood echoing like gunshots. Each impact seemed to slow him for a fraction of a second before the relentless pull of the earth took him again. The final impact, when he struck the needle-strewn forest floor, was a dull, final thud that seemed to shake the very ground. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. For a moment, no one moved, frozen in a tableau of horror. Then chaos erupted. Men dropped their tools and ran, their shouts overlapping into a panicked, incoherent roar. They crowded around Jake's broken form, their faces masks of terror and helplessness. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was a wet, ragged gasp, and one of his legs was bent at an impossible angle, the bone a stark, white protrusion against the dark fabric of his trousers. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, painting the brown pine needles beneath him a glossy crimson. Foreman Briggs bellowed for a medic kit, for a stretcher, his voice cracking with a strain that went beyond the immediate crisis. This was the fear they all lived with, the one they never spoke of, made horrifically real. Amid the cacophony of panicked shouts and frantic movements, Elias stood rooted to the spot, his blood running cold. It was not the sight of the broken body that held him transfixed, terrible as it was. It was the sound that wove through the human chaos, a sound only he seemed to hear. The wind, which had been still, now stirred the highest branches of the pines, and within that stirring came the whispers. They were clearer now, sharper, as if given strength by the violence. They slithered through the panic, a chorus of spectral voices that held a chilling, ancient malice. And then he heard it, a single name, spoken not by one voice, but by many, a sibilant harmony that cut through the din and lodged in his mind like a shard of ice. Annabelle. The name hung in the air, a ghost on the breeze, and with its utterance, every strange occurrence of the past days snapped into a terrible, focused alignment. The carvings on the bunkhouse were not random art. They were wards or prayers. The whispers in the night were not imagination. They were a presence. The accidents were not coincidence. They were a purpose. And the shared birth year in the ledger was not a statistical anomaly. It was a bloodline. This name, Annabelle, was the key. It was the source of the dread that haunted the trees and the hearts of the men. Jake's fall was not a tragic accident of frayed rope. It was a message. And as the men finally lifted Jake's groaning form onto a makeshift stretcher, their movements frantic and fearful, Elias's resolve crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. He would find out who Annabelle was, and what terrible history bound these men to her wrath. The investigation was no longer a matter of curiosity. It had become a necessity for survival. The camp moved with the heavy, subdued rhythm of a funeral procession in the wake of Jake's fall. The big man had been carried to the infirmary shack, his groans a constant, low reminder of the fragility of their existence in this cursed place. Work had been called off for the day, and the loggers drifted in small, silent clusters, their eyes hollow, their hands restless without the familiar weight of their axes. They avoided looking at the tall pine, now a monument to their shared terror. Elias watched them from the doorway of the bunkhouse, the name Annabelle echoing in his mind with the persistence of a tolling bell. He knew the answers would not come from the frightened majority, nor from the tight-lipped Foreman Briggs. They would come from the one man who had been here the longest, who carried the weight of the camp's history in the deep grooves of his face and the weary slump of his shoulders. He found Old Man Henry where he was always found when not working. Sitting on a stump at the edge of the clearing, whittling a piece of pine with a bone-handled knife. His movements were slow, deliberate, the shavings falling in delicate curls to the ground. He was a relic, his skin like tanned leather, his hair a wild shock of white, but his pale blue eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He did not look up as Elias approached, but the rhythm of his whittling slowed almost imperceptibly. Elias sat on a nearby log, the damp chill of the wood seeping through his trousers. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, broken only by the soft scritch-scratch of the knife. He knew direct questions would be met with the same defensive fear Tom had shown. Instead, he spoke of the silence, the oppressive weight of the woods, the feeling of being watched by something that was not quite there. He mentioned the carvings on the bunkhouse, tracing their strange patterns in the air with his finger. Henry's whittling stopped. He lifted his head, his ancient eyes fixing on Elias with an unnerving intensity. For a long moment he simply stared, as if measuring the newcomer's soul. Then, his gaze drifted past Elias, toward the deep, brooding shadows of the forest, and his voice emerged, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. He spoke in fragments, his story a patchwork of half-remembered lore and personal dread. A long time ago he began, before the camp was even a thought, this land belonged to a family. There was a woman, Annabelle. Her name was spoken with a reverence that was instantly swallowed by fear. She was not from the town. She was of this place, her spirit woven into the very soil and the sap of the trees. She had been wronged. The men who first came, the founders of the camp, had done something to her. Henry's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes darting around the clearing. He would not say what, only that it was a betrayal so profound it had stained the land itself. His gnarled fingers tightened around the piece of wood in his hand. Annabelle, he murmured, had laid a curse before she was driven out, or perhaps before she died. He was vague on this point, as if the truth was too dangerous to hold. A curse on her own blood. She swore that her line would never know peace, that when her descendants gathered in this place, her vengeance would walk among them. Her voice would be in the wind, her anger in the shadows. The accidents, the whispers, the feeling of being slowly hunted. It was all her. Then, as quickly as the floodgate had opened, it slammed shut. A branch cracked somewhere in the woods, a normal sound of the forest, but Henry flinched as if it were a gunshot. His face, which had been animated with the grim passion of his tale, went slack with terror. He shook his head, his white hair flying. He had said too much. Speaking her name was like ringing a dinner bell for the darkness. He begged Elias, his voice cracking, to let it lie, to pack his things and ride out before the sun set. The past was a grave, he whispered, and digging only brought up things that were never meant to see the light. He would not answer any more questions. He would not look at Elias again. He simply returned to his whittling, his movements now frantic and unsteady, the knife biting deep and jagged into the wood. He had given Elias the key, the name, the wrong, the curse on the bloodline. But the old man's palpable fear was a more powerful warning than any story. It was the raw, undiluted terror of a man who had lived with a ghost for decades, and knew that her patience was finally wearing thin. The old man's fear was a contagion, seeping into the very air of the camp and turning the golden afternoon light into something jaundiced and sickly. Elias retreated to the bunkhouse, the name Annabelle and Henry's fragmented warnings chasing themselves in a frantic loop inside his head. The ledger, that dusty, damning book, felt as though it were burning a hole through the floorboards where he had hidden it. He waited until the bunkhouse was empty. The men gathered outside for a somber, silent supper, their appetites stolen by Jake's broken body and the unspoken dread that now had a name. In the dim, dusty quiet, he retrieved the ledger and laid it open on his cot. He then took out a sheet of rough paper and a stub of pencil, his hand steady despite the cold not tightening in his stomach. This was no longer about curiosity. It was an act of excavation, of unearthing a truth that the land itself seemed determined to keep buried. He began with the names Henry had let slip, the men from the early days, the founders who had wronged Annabelle. He wrote them at the top of the page, their names like headstones. Then, using the ledger's meticulous, morbid record, he started to trace the lines downward, through the decades. It was a slow, painstaking process, a genealogist's nightmare scrawled in the gloom. He cross-referenced birth years, looking for the telltale repetition of 1866, but he was searching for something deeper now, connections. He looked for shared surnames in different generations, for men who listed the same remote township as their place of origin. The pattern that began to emerge from the tangled web of ink and dates was so stark, so horrifyingly simple, that it stole the breath from his lungs. The men of the camp were not a random collection of souls drawn together by the need for work. They were a family, a sprawling, disconnected, and largely unknowing family, but a family nonetheless. The red-haired logger, Red, shared a great-grandfather with the quiet, sallow-faced Tom. Sam, the man with the axe cut, was a second cousin to Jake, who now lay broken in the infirmary. Branch by branch, line by line, Elias's pencil sketched a tree whose roots all led back to a single gnarled trunk. Every man bearing the cursed birth year, and many others besides, could trace their lineage back to one of the original founders of the camp. And all those founders, in their turn, were connected by a single terrible thread. Annabelle. She was not just a wronged woman from a ghost story. She was the matriarch. This was her bloodline. The curse old Henry had whispered of was not a vague spectral threat. It was a precise, inherited poison. These men, gathered here in the heart of her stolen land, were all her descendants, the living fruit of the tree her betrayers had planted. The camp was not haunted by a random spirit. It was being judged by its ancestor. The whispers in the night were a grandmother's lullaby of vengeance. The shifting shadows were her disapproving gaze falling upon her own kin. The accidents were not misfortunes. They were a purging, a violent pruning of her own corrupted family tree. Elias leaned back, the piece of paper in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. The family tree he had sketched was a map of the curse itself. It explained the shared dread, the collective silence, the way the men seemed bound together by something far stronger than shared labor. They were bound by blood, tainted blood, and he, an outsider, had stumbled into the middle of their long-delayed reckoning. He looked at the names on the page, at the web of lines connecting the living to the dead, and he understood with a chilling finality that there would be no escaping this. They were all trapped here, not by the wilderness, but by the sins of their fathers, and the unforgiving memory of the woman they all called grandmother. Armed with the terrible clarity of the family tree, Elias moved through the camp with a new and chilling understanding. Every face now seemed to him a variation on a theme, every pair of eyes a window into the same cursed lineage. The shared set of a jaw, the similar slope of a brow, these were no longer coincidences but confirmations of the blood bond that damned them all. He could not hold this knowledge inside. It was a poison that demanded an outlet, a truth that needed to be witnessed to be believed. He began cautiously, approaching the men not with accusation, but with a quiet, probing curiosity, hoping to find a crack in their wall of silence. He found the logger named Micah mending a harness near the stables. Speaking softly, Elias mentioned the old families of the territory, asking if Micah's people had hailed from these parts. The man's friendly demeanor evaporated, his hands stilling on the leather strap. He muttered something about not knowing, about it not matching, and quickly busied himself with a task on the far side of the stall, his back a clear and final dismissal. Undeterred, Elias tried again with another man, a younger logger named Ben. He framed it as a question about local history, wondering if Ben had ever heard stories of the original settlers, of a woman named Annabelle. Ben's face, usually open and amiable, shut down completely. A flicker of raw panic showed in his eyes before he looked away, shaking his head and walking off toward the timber line without a word, as if fleeing a physical threat. Each failed attempt tightened the coil of tension in the camp. The men began to exchange uneasy glances when Elias drew near. Their conversations would falter, their laughter, when it rarely occurred, would die in their throats. He was no longer just a newcomer. He was a disturbance, a rock thrown into the stagnant pond of their shared fear, and the ripples were spreading fast and wide. The breaking point came at the evening meal. The men were gathered around the fire, eating their stew in a heavy silence. Elias, sitting a little apart, looked across the circle at the hulking form of Red. The man's fiery hair and brutish features were a stark contrast to the more refined lines of Tom's face. Yet Elias's sketched tree clearly showed their common great-grandfather. The compulsion to confirm it, to see the recognition in another's eyes, was too strong. He caught Red's gaze and spoke softly, his words meant for him alone. "Red, your mother's name was Connolly, wasn't it? From the Northern Valley." The effect was volcanic. Red's spoon clattered into his tin bowl. He rose to his feet with a slow, menacing deliberation that silenced the entire camp. The firelight carved deep shadows into his contorted face, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and terror. He took 2 heavy steps toward Elias, his massive hands clenching into fists of gnarled wood and scarred knuckle. He loomed over him, his breath a cloud of steam in the chill air, smelling of stew and cheap whiskey. He did not shout. His voice was a low, guttural growl, each word dripping with venom. He told Elias to shut his mouth. He told him to bury his questions in a deep, dark hole and forget they ever existed. He leaned in closer, his face inches away, and promised, in a whisper that carried to every man present, that if he ever spoke of families or histories again, he would personally break him in 2 and leave his body for the wolves. The threat was not an empty one. It was a pledge born of a primal, cornered animal fear. Before Elias could respond, Foreman Briggs was between them, his own face a mask of strained authority. He placed a firm hand on Red's chest, pushing the larger man back a step. His voice boomed across the clearing, not in defense of Elias, but in a plea for order. He ordered Red to stand down. Then he turned to Elias, and the look in his eyes was not one of support, but of profound disappointment and alarm. He spoke to Elias, but his words were for the whole camp. He told him his questions were done. He said that digging up the past was like kicking a hornet's nest, and they were all getting stung. His priority was the work, the safety, the fragile peace of the camp. Elias's investigations, he declared, were a disruption they could not afford. The order was clear, final, and absolute. Cease. Stop asking. Stop looking. Let the dead bury the dead. The men watched, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and renewed fear. Red stood glowering, his chest still heaving. Briggs's order had not dispelled the hostility. It had merely capped it, forcing the seething dread back beneath the surface. Elias was left standing alone, the focus of every anxious and accusing eye. He had sought the truth, and in finding it, he had unleashed the very thing the men feared most: the open acknowledgement of the curse that bound them. The silence that fell over the camp was heavier than ever, thick with unspoken names and the rising specter of Annabelle's wrath. The silence that followed Briggs's command was a living entity, thick and suffocating. The men finished their meals with a grim, mechanical haste, their eyes carefully avoiding Elias as they dispersed into the twilight, melting away into the bunkhouse or the shadows of the clearing. He was an island, marooned in a sea of shared dread. The order to cease his investigation was a wall, but the truth was a fire burning in his mind, and it would not be contained. He knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical weight, that the final piece of the puzzle was here, hidden within the very structure that housed them. The bunkhouse, with its scarred walls and whispering corners, held the secret. It was Annabelle's story, and he was certain she had left a testament. He waited until the deep of night, when the ragged symphony of snores filled the air and the whispers had begun their nightly circuit, a soft, sibilant counterpoint to the men's breathing. Moving with a thief's caution, he slipped from his cot. He did not need a lamp. The faint glow from the banked fire in the stove was enough to navigate by. His fingers, guided by memory and intuition, went to the wall beside his bunk, to the section of carved symbols that had first caught his eye. They felt different now, not just as patterns, but as a language. He traced the coiled, serpentine lines, the angular runes, the faces twisted in agony. His fingers found a slight irregularity, a panel of wood that seemed less firmly seated than the others, its edges worn smooth by time and perhaps by other, furtive touches. Applying careful pressure, he felt the wood give with a soft, gritty sigh. It was a small, hidden compartment, cleverly concealed within the grotesquerie of the carvings. His heart hammered against his ribs as he reached inside. His fingertips brushed against something dry and brittle, a folded piece of paper that felt as fragile as a moth's wing. He drew it out, a single yellowed page, its edges crumbling. He retreated to the sliver of moonlight falling through a high, grimy window. Unfolding the page was an act of reverence, the paper crackling softly in protest. The handwriting was a woman's, elegant and flowing, but the ink was blotted in places, the lines trailing off as if the writer's hand had been shaking with rage or grief. It was a diary entry, a final, furious testament. "They have taken everything," it began. My home, my name, my future. My own brothers, my flesh and blood, have cast me out for the crime of loving a man they deemed unsuitable. They call it protection. I call it a betrayal that has carved my heart from my chest. They think to be rid of me, to bury my memory and my claim to this land as they bury their own consciences. But a woman scorned is not so easily erased. Elias's breath caught. The words were not just ink. They were a voice from the grave, sharp and clear and burning with a cold fire. They gather here, on the soil that is my birthright, and build their empire of timber, thinking their strength lies in their numbers, in their shared blood. They are fools. Our blood is my weapon. I lay this upon them and upon all who come from their line. When my descendants gather in this place, when the fruit of their betrayal stands upon my stolen ground, my voice will be in the wind that shakes the trees they fell. My anger will be the shadow that trips their step, the flaw in the rope, the slip of the axe. They sought to erase me, so I will ensure they never forget. Let every accident, every whisper, every drop of blood spilled here be a remembrance of the sister they forgot. Let their prosperity be their curse. This I swear. The final words were a stark, powerful slash of ink across the page. Elias slowly refolded the paper, his hands trembling. This was it. The full, terrible truth. Annabelle was not some mythical crone or a random spirit. She was the forgotten sister, betrayed and exiled by the very men who founded the camp. Her curse was not a vague haunting. It was a precise, supernatural law she had enacted upon her own bloodline. The accidents, Sam's cut, Jake's fall, were not random misfortunes. They were the deliberate, vengeful workings of her oath, triggered by the gathering of her descendants in the one place she could not abide them. The camp was not just a workplace. It was a killing floor of her own design, and every man here was both executioner and victim, bound by a shared ancestry to a tragedy they had inherited but never understood. The diary page was not just a clue. It was the verdict, and they were all living the sentence. The diary page was a ghost in his hands, its brittle weight holding a century of fury. Elias sat in the bunkhouse gloom, the whispers of the sleeping men around him fading into a dull hum as the voice from the past roared in his mind. Annabelle's words were not just an explanation. They were a key turning in a lock he had not known existed, opening a door into a cold, dark chamber of understanding. He pieced her story together, the fragments from Henry's fearful tales and the stark confession of the diary merging into a single, tragic narrative. He saw her not as a specter, but as a young woman of fire and spirit, her life woven into the deep soil and towering pines of this land long before the first axe bite scarred a trunk. This was her inheritance, her soul's home. And he saw the brothers, the camp's founders, their names now stark and accusing on his sketched family tree, men of ambition and rigid pride. They saw her love for an outsider, a man they deemed unworthy, as a threat to their plans, a stain on their name. Their betrayal was not a simple disagreement. It was a brutal severing. They used the law, or perhaps raw force, to strip her of her claim, to exile her from the only world she had ever known, casting her out into a wilderness far crueler than the one they now sought to tame. Her curse, then, was not the act of a mad woman, but the calculated, devastating retaliation of a heart turned to stone by betrayal. It was a masterpiece of vengeance, elegant in its cruelty. She did not curse strangers. She cursed her own blood, the very line that had sprung from the same roots as hers. She turned their greatest strength, their familial bond, their shared lineage that allowed them to build this camp together, into their ultimate weakness. The curse was a dormant poison in their veins, inert and harmless as they scattered across the territory. But when they gathered here, on the land stolen from her, their collective presence acted as a trigger. It was a reunion she had orchestrated from beyond the grave, a summons her descendants unknowingly answered, drawn by the promise of work and camaraderie, only to find themselves prisoners in a cage of their own ancestry. The whispers in the night were not random hauntings. They were her voice, the constant, sibilant reminder of her presence, the echo of her grievance that would never be silenced. The shifting shadows were her gaze, watching her kin with a cold, unforgiving eye. And the accidents, the inexplicable slip of an axe, the sudden failure of a sound rope, were her direct intervention. They were not acts of a chaotic spirit, but the deliberate, targeted strikes of a wronged matriarch pruning her own corrupted family tree. Each drop of blood spilled on this ground was a tribute to her memory, a payment extracted for the life and love that had been stolen from her. Elias looked around the dark bunkhouse, at the sleeping forms of the men. They were no longer just loggers. They were living monuments to a familial sin. Red's bluster, Tom's quiet terror, Sam's nervous energy, Jake's broken body. They were all symptoms of the same disease, a sickness of the bloodline that festered only here, in this specific place. Annabelle's vengeance was not a swift execution, but a slow, grinding torment. She had ensured that her brother's legacy would not be an empire of timber, but a generations-long sentence of fear and blood, a perpetual atonement for a crime they had long forgotten, but she had sworn they would always remember. The curse's origin was not in magic, but in a love twisted into an eternal, unforgiving hate, and its power lay in the inescapable truth of shared blood. The weight of the diary page felt like a stone in Elias's pocket, a cold, hard truth that demanded to be cast into the stagnant pool of the camp's collective denial. He could not carry it alone any longer. The rising sun did little to burn away the dread that had settled over the clearing. It only illuminated the deep-set fear in the men's eyes as they shuffled from the bunkhouse, their movements heavy with a resignation that went beyond physical fatigue. They gathered for a sparse breakfast, the usual clatter of tin cups subdued, their gazes avoiding the dark line of trees as if it were an executioner's wall. Elias knew this was the moment. The fragile peace Briggs had enforced was a lie, and the truth was the only tool sharp enough to cut through it. He did not ask for permission. He simply stood on an upturned crate near the cookfire, the morning mist coiling around his boots like ghostly fingers. The men's attention, sluggish and wary, slowly turned toward him. Foreman Briggs, seeing him, began to rise with a warning on his lips, but Elias's voice, clear and steady, cut through the damp air before he could speak. He began not with accusations, but with facts, laying them out like evidence at a trial. He spoke of the ledger, of the recurring birth year that bound them not by chance, but by blood. He described the family tree he had pieced together, naming the founding brothers, tracing the lines down through the decades to the very men standing before him, to Red and Tom, to Sam and the injured Jake. He watched as recognition, ugly and unwelcome, dawned on their faces. Then he spoke her name, Annabelle. The word landed among them like a physical blow. He told them of the forgotten sister, betrayed and exiled, her love and her inheritance stolen by the very men whose names they shared. He held up the brittle diary page, not reading from it, but quoting its final, furious oath, her curse upon her own bloodline. For a heartbeat, there was only a profound, ringing silence. The truth, so long buried and feared, now hung in the open air, naked and undeniable. Then chaos erupted. It was not the chaos of shouted arguments or denials, but something far more visceral and terrifying. A logger named Pete dropped his axe, which he had been idly sharpening. The honed steel head, falling, did not simply thud into the earth but seemed to twist in the air, the handle splintering with a sound like a gunshot. From the tool shed came a series of metallic shrieks as saw blades warped on their racks, the sound of tortured metal tearing through the morning calm. A coil of heavy rope, hanging from a peg, unraveled itself in a sinuous, impossible movement, slithering to the ground like a dead snake. And through it all, the whispers came. They were no longer a faint, nocturnal murmur but a roaring chorus that filled the clearing, rising from the very soil and pouring from the forest. They were no longer indistinct. They were a cacophony of a single voice, multiplied and layered, speaking the name Annabelle over and over in a tone of ancient, vindictive triumph. The sound was not in their ears, but in their minds, a psychic assault that made men clap their hands to their heads, their eyes wide with a terror that was now fully realized. The wind, which had been still, rose in a sudden, icy gust that tore at their clothes and sent embers from the cook fire spinning into the air like angry fireflies. Red, his face a mask of fury and panic, stumbled backward, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. His mouth worked, but no sound came out, his threat from the previous night rendered meaningless by the supernatural confirmation unfolding around them. Tom had sunk to his knees, his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth as if trying to soothe a pain that had no physical source. Foreman Briggs stood frozen, his authority utterly dissolved, his face ashen as he watched his world, the order he had fought to maintain, crumble into supernatural ruin. The malfunctioning tools, the roaring whispers, the sentient wind. It was all a performance, a brutal, undeniable demonstration staged by the ghost in the woods. There were no more questions, no more doubts. The curse was not a story. It was the law of this land, and they were all guilty by birthright, standing condemned on the stolen ground of their grandmother's grave. The air in the clearing grew thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere were congealing around the men. The roaring whispers did not fade with the morning light but deepened, becoming a constant, chiding pressure against their skulls. A sound like dry leaves skittering over stone and rotten wood. The wind died again, leaving an unnatural stillness that was somehow more menacing than the earlier gale. The broken axe handle, the warped saw blades, the unraveled rope. They were not just malfunctions. They were promises. The curse, having been openly acknowledged, was no longer content with subtle accidents. It was flexing its power, and its hunger had become a palpable force in the clearing. It was Tom, still on his knees, who gave voice to the new, chilling understanding. His words were a broken whisper, barely audible over the psychic hum. He said it wasn't just about fear or pain anymore. The whispers were clear to him now, a direct command echoing in the hollows of his mind. A life. It demanded a life. A blood sacrifice to atone for the original betrayal, a payment to quiet the vengeful ghost. The words hung in the suffocating air, and every man felt the truth of them in his marrow. This was the next inevitable step. The haunting had become a hunt. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the stunned silence. The men turned on each other, their shared bloodline now a source of accusation rather than unity. Fear stripped away the last vestiges of their camaraderie, revealing the raw, desperate animal beneath. Voices rose, sharp and cracking with hysteria. Some argued it should be the oldest, Henry, who had lived with the knowledge the longest. Others pointed to the weakest, the injured Jake, who was already halfway to the grave and would be a mercy. The suggestions were brutal, pragmatic, and laced with a terrifying self-preservation. Then the focus shifted. Red, his face a thundercloud of rage and fear, rounded on Elias. His finger, thick and calloused, stabbed through the heavy air like a weapon. He was the reason they were in this hell, Red snarled. He was the one who had dug up the past, who had spoken the name aloud and made the ghost real. He had poked the sleeping beast, and now it was wide awake and hungry. It was his fault Jake was broken, his fault the tools were ruined, his fault the whispers were screaming in their heads. He didn't share their blood. He was an outsider. Let the curse take him. Let his life be the price for their peace. A grim chorus of agreement rose from a knot of men, their eyes gleaming with a desperate, ugly hope. They advanced not as a coordinated mob, but as a pack of cornered wolves, ready to throw the weakest member to the predator. Elias stood his ground, the diary page a fragile shield in his mind. He had uncovered the truth to save them, to find a way out, but in their terror, they saw only a scapegoat. The curse's true power was revealed not in the whispering wind or the broken tools, but in this. It could turn men into monsters, willing to sacrifice one of their own to appease a wrath they had inherited. The argument over who must pay was a grotesque perversion of justice, a frantic scramble in the dark, and Elias realized with a cold clutch of fear that the curse did not just demand a life. It demanded they destroy each other to provide it. The argument over the sacrifice shattered what little cohesion remained. The grim proposal to offer up Elias hung in the air, a toxic cloud of desperation that some of the men clung to like a lifeline. But for others, the thought of spilling blood, even in outsiders, was a line they were not yet ready to cross. Their terror sought a different outlet, a more primal instinct: flight. If the curse was tied to this place, to the very soil Annabelle had sworn to haunt, then leaving it behind was their only hope. The idea spread through the panicked group like a fever, a frantic, ill-conceived plan born of pure animal panic. 3 of the younger loggers, Mike, Ben, and a quiet man named Carl, made the decision. Their reasoning was a frantic, whispered calculus. They were strong, they were fast, and they carried no serious injuries. They would take what supplies they could carry and head east, toward the distant rumor of a river and the trappers' trails that supposedly led back to civilization. They did not say goodbye. As the afternoon light began to wane, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to grasp at them from the forest floor, they simply broke from the group and ran, their figures disappearing into the thick wall of pines at a dead sprint. Their flight was a silent admission of defeat, a surrender to a fear greater than the wilderness itself. For a few moments, a fragile, desperate hope flickered among those left behind. They stood in the clearing, listening to the crashing sounds of the runners fade into the distance, praying that the curse's reach was finite, that its power ended at the edge of the stolen land. But the oppressive silence that had followed the men's departure was more ominous than any sound. The air grew cold, and a thick, unnatural fog began to seep from the ground, not rising like a mist, but pouring from the earth like a spectral tide. It was a pale, swirling gray that swallowed the trees and muffled all sound, a blanket thrown over the world. From within the fog, the sounds began. First, a cry of confusion from Ben, his voice distorted and distant. Then, a shout of alarm from Carl. The men in the camp stood frozen, straining to hear. The sounds of running were replaced by the sounds of struggle, thrashing, cracking branches, and panicked, choked-off yells. It sounded less like men running through a forest and more like men wrestling with the forest itself. Trees seemed to shift and sway in the fog, their branches becoming gnarled, grasping hands. Roots, unseen in the murk, seemed to rise from the soil to trip fleeing feet. The very geography of the woods, familiar to them from years of work, became a treacherous, shifting maze designed to confound and trap. After what felt like an eternity, 2 figures stumbled back into the edge of the clearing, collapsing onto the needle-strewn ground. It was Ben and Carl. They were scraped and bleeding, their clothes torn, their eyes wide with a terror that went beyond physical exhaustion. They gasped out a broken, overlapping story of a forest that had turned against them, of paths that vanished, of trees that moved to block their way, of a cold, invisible force that had pushed them back toward the camp no matter which direction they turned. Foreman Briggs, his face a grim mask, pushed through the crowd and grabbed Ben by the shoulders. "Where's Mike?" he demanded, his voice rough. Ben could only shake his head, his body trembling uncontrollably. Carl, his voice a raw whisper, answered. He said they were together one moment, running side by side through the blinding fog. Then Mike was just gone. There was no cry, no sound of a fall. 1 second his shape was there, a dark blur in the gray, and the next there was only the swirling silent fog. They had called for him, their voices swallowed by the oppressive gloom, but there had been no answer. They had stumbled in circles until they somehow found themselves back at the camp's edge, as if the land itself had spat them back out. The men listened in horrified silence. The failed flight was a more potent demonstration of the curse's power than any whispered threat or malfunctioning tool. Proved there was no escape. The wilderness was not a refuge. It was an extension of Annabelle's prison. And Mike's disappearance was the final, chilling reinforcement of the curse's grip. He had not been sacrificed by the men. He had been taken by the land. His vanishing was a clear, brutal message. They were all here by her will, and they would leave only when she was done with them. The hope that had flickered so briefly was extinguished, replaced by the cold, absolute certainty that they were trapped, and the price for their freedom was still to be paid. Hope was a ghost in the camp, a fleeting memory chased away by the suffocating fog and the echoing silence where Mike's voice should have been. The men huddled near the cookfire, its warmth doing nothing to dispel the chill that had settled in their bones. The failed flight had been the final, crushing blow. They were not just loggers trapped by circumstance. They were prisoners in a cage of their own ancestry, and the warden was a wrathful ghost who controlled the very forest. Arguments had died, replaced by a numb, hollow-eyed resignation. Some stared into the flames as if seeking answers in the embers. Others watched the tree line, expecting at any moment to see Mike's spectral form emerge, or worse, to feel the curse's attention turn to them next. It was in this graveyard quiet that old man Henry stirred. He had been sitting apart, as was his custom, his whittling knife still in his hand but unmoving. The frantic terror that had gripped him when he first spoke of Annabelle was gone, replaced by a deep, weary resolve. The finality of their situation seemed to have scoured the panic from him, leaving behind only the bare bones of memory. He lifted his head, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight like chips of ancient ice, and his dry, rustling voice cut through the despair. He spoke of a story, one his own grandfather had whispered to him on his deathbed, a secret passed down like a cursed heirloom through the damned bloodline. It was not a story of hope, but of possibility, a slender, dangerous thread in the dark tapestry of the curse. Annabelle, in her fury, had been thorough, but she was also a creature of the old ways, of symbols and tokens. The curse could be broken, the grandfather had claimed, but not by force or flight. It required an offering, a gesture of remorse and return. It required a ritual. All eyes were on him now, the men leaning forward, their breath held. Henry described it in fragmented, cautious terms. To break a blood curse, one had to return to its source, to the place where the wrong spirit was anchored to this world. They had to find Annabelle's grave, a hidden, forgotten plot somewhere in the deep woods, a place she had chosen for its solitude and its power. There, they would need to retrieve a token, something that had been hers in life, something that held her essence. A locket, a ring, a fragment of cloth. The story was vague on the specifics, but clear on its purpose. It was a key, but the ritual demanded more than just an object. Henry's voice grew grave, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his kinsmen. It required courage, not the brute courage of felling a tree or facing a bear, but the deeper, more fragile courage to face the past. And it required unity. A fractured, fearful group would never succeed. They had to go to her not as a mob of guilty, panicked descendants, but as a single entity, acknowledging their shared sin and their shared desire for release. It was a plea for mercy, not a demand for freedom, and it had to be made with one voice, one purpose. The ghost in the woods would test them, he warned. She would use their own fears against them, seeking to break their resolve and turn them against one another long before they ever reached her resting place. The ritual was as much about surviving the journey as it was about the final act at the graveside. It was a gauntlet thrown, and picking it up was the most dangerous thing any of them had ever contemplated. But as the men looked from Henry's resolute face to the oppressive, encircling forest, they knew it was the only gauntlet left to pick up. The alternative was to wait and to be picked off one by one. The decision to seek Annabelle's grave was a fragile pact, sealed not with words but with the grim, shared resolve in the eyes of the men who chose to go. In the end, only 5 of them stepped forward as the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky. Elias, whose quest for truth had led them to this precipice. Old Man Henry, whose memory was their only map. Red, his earlier bluster hardened into a sullen, desperate determination. Tom, trembling but unable to bear the waiting any longer, and a younger, broad-shouldered logger named Will, whose quiet strength offered a sliver of hope. They carried no axes, only knives, a coil of good rope, and a few provisions. Their weapons were useless against what they sought to face. Their only shield was the unity Henry had described. The forest welcomed them not with open arms, but with a watchful, malevolent silence. The familiar paths they had trodden for years were gone, obscured by a low, clinging mist that writhed ankle-deep, cold as a grave shroud. Henry led, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on some inner landscape of memory, navigating by landmarks only he could see. A lightning-blasted oak, a trio of stones arranged in a half-circle, a creek that ran unnaturally silent, its waters black and still. The deeper they went, the more the woods seemed to resist them. Thickets of thorny undergrowth, not present the week before, clawed at their clothes and flesh. Fallen logs, slick with a phosphorescent moss, barred their way, forcing them into exhausting detours. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, heavy with the cloying scent of decay and damp earth. The first apparition came as they pushed through a stand of weeping willows, their branches trailing like skeletal fingers in the mist. A figure, pale and indistinct, flickered between the trunks ahead. It was the form of a woman, her hair wild, her back turned. Tom let out a choked cry and stumbled to a halt, but as they watched, the figure dissolved into the swirling fog, leaving behind only a profound cold and the echo of a sigh. Red cursed, his knuckles white on the hilt of his knife, but he kept moving. The second manifestation was more personal. Will, forging ahead, suddenly froze, staring into the mist to their left. The others followed his gaze and saw nothing, but Will's face was a mask of terror. He whispered that he had seen his younger brother, dead these 10 years, beckoning to him from the gloom, his mouth open in a silent scream. Henry gripped Will's arm, his touch firm, and pulled him back to the present, reminding him in a low, steady voice that it was a trick, a phantom spun from their fears. The terrain itself seemed to become a conscious enemy. A slope they were descending suddenly grew impossibly steep, the soil turning to loose, shifting shale that sent them sliding, grabbing at exposed roots that felt like brittle bones. A ravine they needed to cross was spanned by a single, massive fallen tree, but as Elias tested it, the bark crumbled under his hands, revealing the wood beneath to be rotten and hollow, swarming with fat, white insects. They were forced to climb down into the ravine, its floor a quagmire of sucking mud that clung to their boots with a hungry grip, and then scale the other side, their muscles burning with the effort. The final and most potent test came for Red. The mist ahead coalesced into the shape of Foreman Briggs, but it was a Briggs with eyes of solid black and a mouth twisted in a snarl of accusation. The specter pointed a long, bony finger directly at Red and spoke in a voice that was a grotesque parody of Briggs's boom, layered with the sibilant whisper of the curse. It accused Red of cowardice, of being the first to suggest a human sacrifice to save his own skin. It called him a betrayer of his own blood, no better than the brothers who had exiled Annabelle. Red stood his ground, his body rigid, his face a contorted battle of pride and shame. For a terrifying moment, Elias thought the big man would break, that he would turn and flee back into the labyrinthine woods, lost forever. But then Red did something unexpected. He lowered his head, a gesture of submission, and muttered a single, ragged word into the oppressive silence. It was an admission, acceptance of the ghost's charge. The apparition of Briggs shimmered and vanished, and the path ahead, for the first time, seemed to clear slightly. Henry, his breath pluming in the frigid air, nodded grimly. He pointed through a break in the trees. There, in a small, unnaturally circular clearing devoid of mist, was a simple, sunken mound of earth, barely visible beneath a blanket of black moss and withered, gray-leafed vines. There was no headstone, no marker of any kind, but they all felt it. A concentration of the cold, a focal point of the ancient hatred that had pursued them for so long. They had reached the source. They stood at the foot of Annabelle's hidden grave, the heart of the curse, and the true test was about to begin. The clearing was a pocket of absolute stillness, a vacuum in the heart of the whispering woods. The mist that had plagued their journey clung to the trees at its edge like a spectral audience, refusing to encroach upon the sunken mound of earth that was Annabelle's grave. The air was frigid, devoid of the scent of pine or damp soil, carrying only the dry, ancient odor of dust and forgotten things. The 5 men stood at the perimeter, their breath pluming in the unnatural chill, their gazes locked on the unmarked plot. It was a humble, pathetic thing for a vengeance so vast, a simple depression in the forest floor, but the power radiating from it was a physical pressure, a weight that pushed against their chests and made their hearts labor. Old Man Henry was the first to move, his steps slow and reverent. He knelt at the foot of the mound, his gnarled hands hovering over the black moss. He did not speak, but his lips moved in a silent, desperate plea. From his pocket, he drew a small, tarnished silver locket, the only thing of his grandfather's he possessed. He placed it gently on the soil, a personal offering to a grandmother he had never known, but whose wrath had shaped his entire life. He looked at the others, his eyes a silent command. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, a token of their own lives, a piece of themselves offered in return for the peace they sought. Elias stepped forward next, the gravity of the moment settling upon him. He had started this, his quest for truth leading them to this precipice. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, its brass casing warm from his body heat, its steady tick a sound from another world. He laid it beside the locket, a surrender of his past, his lineage, his very sense of time in this timeless place. Tom, trembling, added a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a toy he had kept since childhood. Will placed his prized skinning knife, its honed steel a symbol of his strength and utility. Each offering was a fragment of identity, laid bare before the ancient anger. Only Red remained, standing rigid, his fists clenched. The specter's accusation in the woods had carved a deep wound in his pride. He looked from the humble offerings to the grave, his face a battle of defiance and despair. The whispers, which had been a distant hum, began to intensify, swirling around the clearing, focusing on him. They were no longer a chorus, but a single, sharp, insistent voice, hissing his name, reminding him of his cowardice, his willingness to sacrifice another. The pressure built, the cold deepening until the air itself felt like shards of glass in their lungs. With a strangled cry that was part rage and part surrender, Red lurched forward. He tore a small, faded ribbon from his shirt, a token from a sweetheart in a town he would never see again. But as he moved to place it with the others, the ground at the edge of the grave seemed to liquefy. A patch of black, loamy soil churned, and from it erupted a tangle of gray, root-like tendrils, moving with a horrifying sentient speed. They wrapped around Red's outstretched arm, not with the force of wood, but with the cold, unyielding grip of stone. He roared, pulling back, his immense strength useless against the spectral vines. They did not break. They tightened, and a web of black, frost-like patterns spread from the point of contact, crawling up his arm, across his shoulder, and over his chest. The other men watched in frozen horror as Red's struggles weakened. His shouts became choked gasps, his face turning a waxy, pale gray. The life seemed to be draining from him, siphoned away by the grave. His eyes, wide with terror, met Elias's for a final, fleeting moment. A look not of accusation, but of a terrible, final understanding. Then his body went limp. The tendrils retracted, pulling his form into the soil with a soft, sighing sound. The earth smoothed over, leaving no trace that he had ever been there. The sacrifice the curse had demanded had been chosen and accepted. In the profound silence that followed, a change swept through the clearing. The crushing cold began to recede, replaced by the natural chill of the forest. The oppressive weight lifted from their chests, allowing them to draw a full, clean breath for the first time in days. And the whispers, the constant, maddening soundtrack to their terror, did not simply fade, they unraveled. The sibilant voices softened, losing their malice, becoming a faint, mournful sigh on the wind. The sigh held a note of release, of a burden finally laid down after a century of carrying it. Then, there was only the sound of the real forest, the rustle of a squirrel in the canopy, the distant call of a jay. The four survivors stood for a long time, staring at the now quiet grave. There was no victory in their hearts, only a hollow, exhausted relief. They had broken the curse, but the cost was etched into their souls. They turned as one and walked from the clearing, not looking back. They did not speak as they retraced their path through the now passive woods, the journey back to the camp a somber, silent procession. They gathered their meager belongings, their movements automatic, their eyes avoiding the empty spaces where Red and Mike and Jake should have been. Then they left, walking out of the clearing and onto the trail, away from the cursed land forever. They were free, but they were forever changed, carrying the memory of the whispers and the price of silence deep within them, a part of their bloodline now, a scar where a curse had once festered.